Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid or if something is really wrong, but I need someone to tell me if I'm overreacting before I confront her. I guess I should start with some context. I've been dating Emily for about a year. We moved in together 3 months ago, and until recently things have been great. She's funny, thoughtful, and honestly, she makes me feel like I finally found someone who gets me. There's just one problem. My pets keep dying. I know how that sounds, but I swear to God it wasn't like this before she moved in. I've always loved animals, small kind especially. I have a tank of freshwater shrimp, 2 hamsters, and a gecko. I know they're not the most exciting pets, but they mean a lot to me. I've had most of them for years without issues. Then, right after Emily moved in, things started happening. First, my gecko, Benny, stopped eating. He was perfectly healthy before super active, always darting around his enclosure. But suddenly, he just sat in one spot all the time. He wouldn't touch his food, barely reacted when I picked him up. 2 weeks later, he was dead. I was devastated, but I chalked it up to bad luck. These things happen, right? Then one of my hamsters, Milo, died. Same thing fine one day, sick the next, gone within a week. I had him for almost 3 years with no issues, and then out of nowhere, he just wasted away. I started to feel uneasy after that. 2 pets dying back to back, that wasn't normal. I deep cleaned all my enclosures, checked for mold, checked the temperatures, changed the filters, everything. Then the shrimp started dying. Not all at once, but one by one. Every morning I'd find a few floating at the top of the tank, their legs curled up unnaturally. That's when I started to feel sick. Something wasn't right. I tried to talk to Emily about it. I told her how weird it was, how it felt like all my pets were dying too close together for it to be a coincidence. She looked genuinely sad. She hugged me, told me she was sorry, that she knew how much they meant to me. She even helped me bury Milo in the backyard. For a little while I felt stupid. Of course she wasn't doing anything. She loved animals. She told me once she used to volunteer at a shelter. But then last night happened. And now, I can't ignore the feeling in my gut. I woke up at 2 a.m. to get a drink. As I passed by the living room, I saw Emily sitting on the couch in the dark. I almost called out to her, but then I saw what she was holding. My other hamster, Luna. She was cupped in Emily's hands, completely still. For a second, I thought she was petting her. But then Emily did something that made my stomach twist. She lifted her hand just slightly and let Luna drop. Not far, but enough. Enough to make Luna's tiny body jerk on impact. I must have made a noise because Emily's head snapped up. She saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled just barely. "I think she likes it," she whispered. I just stood there. She lifted Luna again and dropped her. Again. I must have stepped forward without realizing it because Emily suddenly looked surprised, like she had just remembered I was there. She gently placed Luna back in her enclosure. Then she stood up, walked past me, and went back to bed. Like nothing had happened. I barely slept after that. I just sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? Had I seen it wrong? But no. I didn't imagine the way she let Luna fall. I didn't imagine that smile. And now I can't stop thinking about it. What if she wasn't playing? What if she's been hurting them all along? What if Benny, Milo, the shrimp, all of them weren't just accidents? I need to know what you guys think. Because if I'm right, I don't know what to do next. I barely slept after what I saw. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying it. The way Emily lifted Luna, the way she let her drop, the way she smiled. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. that maybe I was just reading into it too much. Maybe she really thought Luna liked it. But deep down, I knew that was bullshit. It wasn't just that moment, it was all of it. Benny getting sick out of nowhere. Milo dying when nothing was wrong. The shrimp floating in my tank one by one. The way Emily acted so normal about it all. Like she wasn't even surprised. Like she already knew what had happened. I spent the next day watching her. Not obviously. I acted normal. I made coffee. I scrolled through my phone. But I kept my eyes on her, looking for something that would confirm my suspicions. She acted exactly the same as always. Sweet, attentive. She kissed me on the cheek before she left for work. She sent me a text in the afternoon. Hope you're feeling better today. Love you, Erwan. And for just a second, I felt insane. Like I was losing it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I had just walked in at the wrong moment last night, and she really was just playing. Maybe all my pets really did just die from bad luck. But then that night, I caught her again. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. I don't even know why. Maybe my subconscious was still on edge, waiting for something to happen. The apartment was silent. But then, just like last time, I saw a faint light from the living room. I slid out of bed carefully so I wouldn't wake her. But when I looked at the blankets, she wasn't there. My stomach dropped. I stepped into the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. And when I turned the corner, I saw her. Sitting on the floor, right in front of Luna's enclosure, holding her again. But this time, she wasn't just dropping her. She was squeezing. Not hard, not enough to kill her, but enough to make her squirm. Enough to make her little body stiffen in discomfort. Emily's face was completely calm, like she was testing something, seeing how far she could go. I don't remember stepping forward, but suddenly I was right there, my voice sharp in the silence. Put her back. Emily's head snapped toward me. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she sighed and gently placed Luna back inside the enclosure. I expected her to be embarrassed, maybe even guilty, but she just looked at me and said, "You're overreacting." My blood went cold. "What the hell is wrong with you?" My voice was low, shaking. "That's not how you handle animals." She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, I wasn't hurting her. You're acting like I was torturing her or something." I felt something dark rise in my chest. "Benny wasn't sick, was he?" I whispered. She froze. For a fraction of a second, something flashed across her face, something I had never seen before. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She sighed again, rubbing her temple. "Jesus, you're being weird. You need to let this go." I just stood there, staring at her. Let it go? Was she serious? She turned and walked past me, back toward the bedroom like nothing had happened. And in that moment, I felt something shift. A part of me that had been making excuses for her for every little thing that felt off. For every pet that had died snapped. I didn't imagine this. I wasn't overreacting. Something was wrong with Emily. And now, I had proof. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room for hours just thinking, trying to piece everything together. How long had she been like this? Had she always been this way and just hid it well? Or was there something deeper? Was this a warning sign? If she could hurt something small, something fragile, something that couldn't fight back, would she stop there? Would it escalate? I don't know. I really don't. This morning she acted like nothing happened. She made coffee. She kissed me before leaving for work. Like last night never happened. Like she hadn't looked me in the eye and told me to let it go. I haven't said anything to her. Not yet. But I've been sitting here all morning wondering what I'm supposed to do. Do I confront her? Do I break up with her? Is this a deal breaker? Or am I just jumping to the worst conclusion? I mean, she didn't kill Luna. Not yet. But how long before she does? And how long before it's not just my pets? I guess what I'm asking is, what do you think? Am I crazy? Or should I be worried? Because honestly, I don't know anymore. I don't even know how to start this, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. I don't know anymore. This happened 2 years ago, and to this day I haven't been able to go camping again. The thought of it makes my stomach twist. So, for context, I've always loved the outdoors. Grew up hiking, camping, doing all that solo survivalist crap that made me feel like some kind of badass. I knew how to handle myself in the woods, how to navigate, how to listen to the sounds of nature and know when something wasn't right. That last part? I wish I had listened to it sooner. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, me and 3 buddies, just a chill guys getaway deep in the mountains. We picked a spot about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, somewhere totally off-grid. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. The first night was perfect. We drank, we laughed, we told dumb horror stories around the fire, the usual. Around 2 a.m. we all finally crashed in our tents. Nothing weird. The second night, though, that's when everything changed. It started subtle. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire alone, just staring into the flames while the others were already in their tents. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The kind of silence that presses in, where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not wind through the trees. An actual voice. Faint, distant, but there. I froze, my skin prickling. It came from beyond the firelight, out in the trees. Too far to make out words, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. At first, I thought maybe one of my friends had gotten up to take a piss and was messing with me. But then I heard another one. A second whisper, layered under the first, coming from the opposite direction. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Wind. Just the wind. Then it moved. The whispering shifted, circling us. One moment it was near the trees behind me, the next it was coming from the right, then the left. Always just outside the fire's glow. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but the words were just out of reach, like a conversation you're not meant to be a part of. Then I laughed. Low, breathless, way too close. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. Just the same unmoving forest. The same tall pines, their black silhouettes swaying against the star-dotted sky. I told myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation, paranoia, the way fire messes with your senses in the dark. So, like an idiot, I convinced myself to ignore it. I put out the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to close my eyes. That was mistake number 1. I don't know how long I laid there, but at some point I drifted off. And then, in the dead of night, something woke me up. A whisper, outside my tent. I stopped breathing. It was so quiet, so deliberate, like someone was crouched, inches from the fabric, speaking directly to me. I couldn't make out the words, but it was low, raspy, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't used to speaking. I wanted to scream, I wanted to move, but I just lay there, my muscles locked up, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Then, slowly the whispering moved, circling the tent. It was multiple voices now, soft, murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot, just beyond understanding. And then the zipper moved. Not a lot, just a little, a soft, slow tug. I snapped out of my paralysis and lunged for my knife. Silence. The whispering stopped. My breath was the only sound in the tent, coming in short, panicked bursts. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my friends were already awake, looking just as freaked out as I felt. Before I could even say anything, Mike, the most level-headed guy in our group, spoke first. You guys heard it too, right? Turns out I wasn't alone. Each of them had woken up at some point in the night to the whispers. They'd heard the voices circling the camp, moving through the trees. But the worst part? None of us had unzipped our tents. But in the dirt around the campsite there were footprints. Not ours. They were thin, bare, too many, circling each tent. We packed up and got the hell out of there within 10 minutes, leaving most of our gear behind. None of us spoke the entire hike back. I don't know what was out there, I don't know what we heard, what we almost saw, but I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in those woods, and whatever was out there, it never wanted us to leave. I haven't been camping since. I don't talk about this night often. Even now, years later, I still get a pit in my stomach when I think about it. At the time, I was 16, doing the usual babysitting gigs for extra cash. It was nothing serious, just watching kids for a few hours while their parents had a night out. Most of the jobs were for neighbors or family friends, but this one was different. I got the job through a woman my mom knew from work. She had a friend, Lauren, who needed a sitter at the last minute. Her usual one had canceled, and she was desperate. I had never met Lauren before, but my mom reassured me she was a single mom with a 4-year-old son, just trying to get a night off. I didn't think much of it. I should have. Lauren's house was about 10 minutes away, tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac. When I got there, it was already dark. The house itself was small but well kept, the kind of place that felt a little too clean, like no one actually lived there. Lauren answered the door looking stressed but friendly. She had on a black dress, her hair pinned up like she had rushed to get ready. "I can't thank you enough for coming," she said, pulling me inside. "Michael's already had dinner, and he's pretty easy. Just put him to bed by 9 and you're good." I nodded, glancing around. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Michael was standing in the hallway, just staring at me. Big brown eyes, blonde hair. He clutched a stuffed Animala floppy. Gray ribbit so tightly his knuckles were pale. Lauren turned to him. "Michael, say hi to Anna." He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there. Lauren sighed, gave me an apologetic smile and grabbed her purse. "He's a little shy." She kissed the top of his head. "Be good for Anna. Okay, Mommy will be back soon." Michael still didn't speak. Lauren hesitated, like she wanted to say something else. Then, under her breath so soft I almost didn't hear it, she muttered, "Stay in the living room." I frowned. "What?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Just call me if you need anything." And then she was gone. The second the door shut, Michael turned and walked away. Not to the couch. Not to his room. Just down the hallway, into the dark. I hesitated, then followed him. "Hey buddy, do you want to watch a movie?" I called after him. No answer. I found him standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at the floor. He didn't turn to look at me. Didn't move at all. I felt my stomach tighten. I took a step closer. "Michael?" Still nothing. I was about to reach for his shoulder when he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "He doesn't like when people go down the hallway." My breath hitched. I forced a laugh. "Who doesn't?" He didn't answer. Just turned and walked back to the living room like nothing happened. I stood there for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Then I shook it off and followed him. The rest of the night was uneventful. At least at first. Michael barely spoke, but he sat next to me on the couch while I put on a movie. When 9 rolled around, I told him it was bedtime. He shook his head. "Come on, bud," I said, standing up. "It's late." He gripped his stuffed rabbit tighter. Then in the same flat, quiet voice he said, "He gets mad when kids go to bed." A chill crept down my spine. I forced another laugh. "Who gets mad?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, "He's watching us." I stared at him. Then I don't know why I looked at the hallway. The air felt wrong. Still, like something was there, waiting. I swallowed hard. "Michael, let's go to bed." He shook his head again. This time, he looked scared. And for the first time that night, his voice wasn't flat. It was small, weak. "Please don't make me," he whispered. I exhaled, trying to stay calm. "Michael, nothing bad is going to happen. You're safe." He didn't answer. Just squeezed his stuffed rabbit to his chest and stared at the hallway. I followed his gaze. The hallway light was off. But for a split second, just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. I grabbed my phone. I was done with this. I didn't care if Lauren thought I was overreacting. Something was wrong. I opened my messages and typed, "Hey, Michael won't go to bed. He keeps saying someone's watching us. Is there a camera in the house or something?" I sent it and waited. 3 dots appeared. Then Lauren's reply. Just 2 words. "Get out." My stomach flipped. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. Then another message popped up. "Take Michael. Get in the car. Do not go near the hallway." A slow, creeping dread filled my chest. I looked at Michael. His face was pale. His little hands were shaking as he clutched his rabbit. I could hear my own breath, too loud in the silence. Then, a soft creak echoed from the hallway, like a door opening. Only there was no door there. Just darkness. And I swear to God, I saw something move inside it. I didn't think. I grabbed Michael's hand and ran, straight to the front door, fumbling with the lock. Michael was crying, whispering something over and over, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Finally, the lock clicked. I yanked the door open and bolted outside, pulling Michael with me. I ran to my car, threw open the door, and shoved him into the passenger seat. Then I turned just for a second, and in the darkened doorway of the house, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, standing in the hallway, watching us. I don't remember getting in the car. I don't remember starting the engine. I just remember speeding down the street, hands shaking on the wheel, Michael sobbing next to me. Lauren's house shrinking in the rearview mirror. And the figure, still standing in the doorway, still watching, like it knew we'd be back. I drove in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Michael was still crying, small, stifled sobs into his stuffed rabbit. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that we were safe, but I wasn't sure if that was true. Lauren's text repeated in my head, over and over. "Get out. Take Michael. Get in the car. Do not go near the hallway." She had known. She had known something was there, and she had left me alone with it. I didn't stop driving until I reached the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station a few miles away. It was bright, flashing neon lights reflecting off the windshield. There were people inside, normal people, and for the first time since I left Lauren's house, I felt like I could breathe again. I turned to Michael. His face was pale, streaked with tears. He still clutched his rabbit so tightly I thought he might rip it apart. "Hey, buddy," I kept my voice soft. "It's okay. We're safe." He didn't respond. Didn't even look at me. His little body was rigid, his eyes locked on the dashboard, like he was afraid to move. I reached for my phone. No new messages from Lauren. I hesitated for a second, then called her. It rang once, twice. Then she answered. "Anna?" Her voice was shaky, breathless. I exhaled in relief. "Lauren, what the hell is going on?" A pause. Then, in a whisper, "Is he with you?" I glanced at Michael. "Yes, we're in my car." Another pause. Then Lauren let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank God." I waited, but she didn't say anything else. "What happened?" I pressed. "Why did you tell me to leave?" I expected her to make something up, to say it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But she didn't. Instead, her voice came back hoarse. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "I thought maybe it would be okay, that it wouldn't act up tonight." I felt my stomach drop. What wouldn't act up? Silence. Then a sniffle. Lauren was crying. "When we first moved in, Michael had night terrors," she said. "At least, that's what I thought they were. He'd wake up screaming about something in the hallway, something watching him." I swallowed hard. "He called it the tall man." The word sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to Michael, still curled up in the passenger seat, his small fingers twisting the ears of his stuffed rabbit. "Michael," I whispered. "The tall man. Is that who you were talking about earlier?" Michael's breathing hitched. Slowly, he turned his head and nodded. My mouth went dry. I turned back to the phone. "Lauren, I saw something in the hallway." A sharp inhale on the other end of the line. Then, in a whisper, "I know." She told me everything. How Michael's terrors got worse. How he refused to sleep in his room, always waking up in tears, saying the tall man was watching. How, at first, she had dismissed it as just a child's imagination, until she started seeing things too. It started small, she said. I'd wake up and find the hallway light on, even though I always turned it off before bed. I'd hear soft creaks in the floorboards, like footsteps. I shivered. But then, she hesitated. Then I saw him. I gripped the phone tighter. "Saw him how?" "I woke up in the middle of the night," she said. "I don't know why. Just that weird feeling you get sometimes. Like something's wrong." I knew that feeling. I had felt it just a few hours ago. I looked at the hallway, Lauren continued, voice shaking. And there he was, tall, thin, standing completely still. I pressed my hand to my mouth. "I only saw him for a second." She swallowed. Then the light flickered, and he was gone. I was shaking now. I had seen him too. Not clearly, not like she had. But I had felt him, standing there, watching us. "Lauren," I whispered, "why didn't you move?" She let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. I broke the lease after 6 months. I was ready to leave." She paused. "But then Michael went missing." My entire body tensed. "What?" She took a deep breath. "It was only for 2 hours. I was packing up and I turned around and he was just gone. I searched everywhere. The cops were on their way." Her voice trembled. And then, out of nowhere, he was back. A heavy silence settled between us. I barely managed to speak. "Where was he?" Lauren sniffled. "I don't know. He didn't remember. He just kept saying the same thing over and over." My pulse hammered. "What did he say?" Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. "He let me go." A wave of nausea rolled through me. I looked at Michael again. He was staring at me now, eyes wide, unblinking. Something inside me twisted. "I think he's attached to Michael," Lauren whispered. I felt cold all over. "The tall man?" "Yes. And I don't know if he's waiting, if he's watching. But every time I tried to leave that house, something brought us back." Her voice cracked. "That's why I still live there." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, staring at Michael, my skin crawling with an invisible weight. "Anna," Lauren said finally, "you need to bring him home." I didn't answer. I was too focused on Michael. His face had changed. He wasn't crying anymore. He looked blank, empty. Then finally spoke. But it wasn't his voice. "He's waiting." I dropped the phone. My hands trembled against the wheel. Michael smiled. Just slightly. I had never seen him smile before. And something told me that wasn't Michael anymore. I stared at Michael, my body frozen, my breath caught in my throat. He had just spoken, but it wasn't his voice. It was something deeper. Something wrong. "He's waiting." That's what he said. And then he smiled. Just slightly. Just enough for me to know that wasn't Michael anymore. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Every instinct in me screamed to get out of the car, to run, to leave him there. But I couldn't. Because whatever was happening, whatever this thing was, Michael was still in there somewhere. I had to get him back. I reached for my phone with a shaking hand and put it on speaker. "Lauren," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Michael just said something." Silence on the other end. Then carefully, "What did he say?" I swallowed. "He said, he's waiting." A sharp inhale. Lauren's voice came back, strained. "Anna, listen to me carefully." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. You need to bring him home. Now. My stomach twisted. Lauren. Now. I turned the key in the ignition. Michael was watching me. His hand still clutched his stuffed rabbit, but his grip was too tight, like he was holding on to something much heavier than fabric. I started driving. He didn't blink, didn't ask where we were going, just sat there, still and silent. It felt wrong, like I wasn't alone in the car, like something else was sitting between us, breathing in the space we couldn't see. The closer we got to the house, the heavier the air became, like a storm building inside my chest. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Lauren was already outside, waiting on the porch. She didn't run toward us, didn't wave. She just stood there, still, like she was afraid to move. I reached for Michael's hand. It was ice cold. "Come on, bud," I whispered. "Let's go inside." For the first time in a long time, he moved. He turned his head toward me, blinking like he was coming out of a fog. Then, in the smallest voice, "I don't want to." I swallowed hard. "Why not?" Michael's lip quivered. "He'll be mad." I felt sick. I took his hand and led him out of the car, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Lauren didn't move from the porch. She just whispered, "Hurry." Michael hesitated at the front steps. For a second I thought he might fight me. But then, all at once, his body went limp, like a puppet with its strings cut. I caught him before he hit the ground, my pulse slamming against my ribs. His small fingers gripped my wrist, tightly. His breath rasped against my arm as he whispered, "Don't let him take me again." I didn't think. I carried him inside. Lauren slammed the door shut behind us, flipping the lock so fast her hands shook. The house was pitch black. The air felt thick, suffocating. Michael was trembling in my arms. Lauren grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the hallway. "We need to put him to bed." I stopped short. "What?" She didn't look at me. "That's the only way." I stared at her. "Lauren, I don't think he needs sleep. I think he needs a priest." She finally turned to face me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. She looked broken. "I know this sounds crazy," she whispered, "but it's the only way to get him back. He has to sleep in his own bed. That's where he was when he disappeared before." I shook my head. "What if that's how he disappeared in the first place?" Lauren's voice cracked. "Then we won't let him go." I carried Michael down the hallway, Lauren's footsteps slow behind me. The closer we got to his room, the more he tensed. I could feel it in his tiny body, the fear. Like he knew what was coming. Like he had done this before. We reached his room. I hesitated at the threshold. The air felt different here. Heavy, stagnant, like something was waiting. Lauren pulled back the blankets. I placed Michael down gently. His eyes were glassy. Lauren whispered, "Close your eyes, sweetheart." Michael whimpered. Then, in a broken whisper, "Please don't let him take me." I squeezed his hand. "We won't." His eyelids fluttered, and then he was asleep. The house went silent, thick, unmoving. Lauren and I stood over his bed, staring at him, waiting. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us breathed. And then, the hallway light flickered. A sharp, static sound hissed through the air. And behind us, a creak. Slow, deliberate, like a footstep on old wood. Lauren's grip tightened on my arm. We weren't alone. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just kept my eyes on Michael. His little chest rose and fell, slow and steady. Lauren whispered something. A prayer, maybe. A plea. The air shifted. A low, creaking sound moved past us, toward the bed. Michael shuddered in his sleep. Lauren squeezed her eyes shut. And then, the closet door creaked open. A rush of air blew through the room. Michael jerked. Lauren grabbed my hand. "Hold him," she whispered. "Hold him tight." I did. His body went rigid. Then, for a single unbearable moment, Everything went still. And then the house exhaled, a low, quiet breath, and Michael relaxed. The air lightened. The hallway was empty again. Lauren let out a shuddering sob. I looked down. Michael's face was peaceful, like he had finally been let go. Lauren moved a few months later. She never told me where. I never asked. I don't know if the tall man followed her, or if he's still in that house waiting for the next child. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, and for a split second, I swear I can see a shadow standing in the hallway, watching, waiting for someone new. I moved into this apartment 6 months ago, and for the most part it's been quiet. It's a small building, only 6 units in total, and most of the tenants keep to themselves. No crowded hallways, no unnecessary interactions. The layout is simple. 3 floors, 2 units per level. I live on the 2nd floor, apartment 2B, and the unit next to mine 2 has been vacant since I moved in. I know because I asked the landlord when I signed the lease. He mentioned it offhand, saying the last tenant moved out suddenly and he hadn't gotten around to renting it again. I didn't think much of it at the time. Then I started hearing the screams. It started a few weeks ago. At first I thought I had imagined it. I was up late working on my laptop with my headphones in when I heard something faint. I pulled out my earbuds and listened. A voice, muffled but unmistakable. A woman, crying. I sat there for a moment, waiting to hear more. It was so distant, so quiet, that I thought maybe it was just someone on the street. But then it happened again, closer this time. It was coming from 2A, the vacant apartment. I stood up, pressing my ear to the wall that separated my unit from the one next door. The sobbing was clearer now, soft, broken, raw. And then, all at once, it stopped. I waited, held my breath, listened for movement. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that old buildings make weird noises, that maybe I had been hearing something from another floor, another unit, another explanation that didn't involve someone crying in an empty apartment. That worked for one night. Then it happened again. This time, I was ready. I checked the clock, 2:03 a.m. The same sound-muffled sobs, like someone desperately trying to keep quiet but failing. I moved closer to the wall, listened. The crying grew louder, then suddenly cut off with a sharp gasp. And then, footsteps. Not mine. Not above me. Inside 2A, I backed away from the wall, my pulse hammering. There shouldn't be anyone in there. The landlord said it was empty. No one had moved in. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the building's emergency maintenance number. I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? I think I heard something in the empty apartment next door. I knew how that would go. They'd send someone over the next day, take a quick look around, and tell me I was hearing things. I locked my door instead. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I caught my landlord in the hallway. He's an older guy, always wearing the same faded flannel and a pair of jeans that look like they've been through 100 washes too many. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Someone moved into 2A?" He frowned. Number, still empty. I hesitated. "You sure?" His frown deepened. "Why?" I shrugged. "I thought I heard something last night. Sounded like someone was in there." He let out a dry chuckle. "Unless they're paying rent under the table, there shouldn't be." I tried to gauge his reaction. He didn't seem worried, didn't even seem particularly interested. "You got thin walls," he said, already turning toward the stairwell. "Sound carries." That was the end of the conversation. Thin walls. That was the answer I was supposed to accept. But thin walls don't explain what happened the next night. I was already on edge, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. 2 a.m. Silence. 2:02 a.m. Still nothing. 2:05 a.m. Then, a knock. Not on my door. On the wall between my apartment and 2A. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. I sat up so fast I nearly lost my balance. I didn't move, didn't breathe. 3 more knocks. Closer. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. I moved toward the wall, pressing my palm against the cold surface. The apartment was supposed to be empty. I knocked back. Once, a pause. Then, the sound of something scraping against the floor. Not a shuffle, not footsteps. Something being dragged. I stumbled back, my mind racing through every possible explanation. An animal? A squatter? A mistake? I grabbed my phone and called my landlord. It went to voicemail. I swallowed hard, staring at the wall, my thoughts a tangled mess. I needed to see inside that apartment, and I wasn't going to wait for permission. The next morning, when the landlord wasn't around, I checked the maintenance closet in the basement. It was unlocked. I found the master key. I held it in my palm, my fingers pressing into the cold metal. If I was wrong, I'd look like an idiot. Maybe I'd even get in trouble. But if I was right, I had to know. That night, I waited until 1:45 a.m. I stood outside 2A, key in hand. At 2 a.m., I heard it again. A muffled sob. I slid the key into the lock, pulse pounding. Turned it. The door clicked open. I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, untouched, the kind of scent places get when they've been closed off for too long. I took a slow step forward. The floor creaked beneath my weight. The apartment was dark, but I could just make out the outlines of covered furniture, empty counters, a bare mattress on the floor. And then, a whisper, right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun, but there was nothing. Just an empty doorway leading into the bathroom. I backed up, my skin crawling, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I reached for the door handle. That's when I noticed it. The closet. The door was slightly open, and inside, through the narrow gap, a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me. I couldn't move. The eyes in the closet were locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. For a moment, everything around me disappeared. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the walls were closing in, like the entire apartment was holding its breath. Then the door creaked open another inch. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and swung my flashlight inside. The closet was empty. The light flickered over bare walls, an old wooden shelf, and dust floating in the stale air. No one was there. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had seen something. I knew I had. I scanned the space again, taking slow, careful steps forward. The closet was deeper than I expected, narrow but long, stretching further back than it should have. The walls had patchy, uneven paint, as if something had been covered up. And then my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach drop. Fingernail scratches. Dozens of them, lining the back wall. Some were old, faded, like they had been there for years. Others were sharper, fresher, deeper. My breath came too fast now, my fingers tingling with adrenaline. Someone had been in here. Not recently, but at some point, someone had clawed at this wall. I reached out, hesitating, then pressed my palm against the back panel. It felt hollow, the tiniest gap between the wood and the drywall. I curled my fingers under the edge and pulled. The entire panel shifted. Behind it, a dark, gaping hole. A hidden passage. And that's when I heard it. A sharp inhale. Not mine. From inside the wall. I staggered backward, barely managing to catch myself before I fell. My flashlight wobbled in my grip, the beam slicing through the darkness like a blade. The breath had been soft, faint, but it was real. Someone was in there. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the closet door, yanked it shut, and bolted. Out of 2A, out of the hallway, into my own apartment, where I locked both the deadbolt and the chain, my hands shaking as I slid to the floor. What the hell had I just found? I didn't sleep. The next morning I debated calling the cops, but what was I supposed to say? I think there's a hidden passage in an empty apartment, and I heard breathing inside it. That was the fastest way to get them to shrug it off or worse, think I'd lost it. Number, I needed proof. I spent the entire day pretending things were normal. Went to work, ran errands, answered texts like I wasn't unraveling. Then, at midnight, I grabbed a small camera I used for work, set it to night vision, and slipped out of my apartment. I knew if I waited too long, I'd lose my nerve. I unlocked 2A again and slipped inside. It was colder tonight, or maybe it just felt that way. The closet door was still shut. I stood there for a moment, gripping the camera so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, I moved forward and opened the door. The closet looked exactly the same scratches along the walls, the hollow panel, the passage behind it gaping like an open wound. I turned on the camera. Then, without giving myself time to hesitate, I reached inside. The air was cooler in there, stagnant. I pushed the camera in further, angling it toward the unseen space beyond. I hit record. Then I pulled my arm back and shut the closet door. I left immediately. Back in my own apartment, I locked the door behind me and sat on the floor staring at the camera in my hands. I didn't want to watch the footage, but I had to. I took a deep breath, clicked play, and let the recording run. The screen flickered to life. The grainy night vision captured everything in eerie green and black. The closet, the panel, the hidden passage. The footage moved as I pushed the camera inside, catching glimpses of what lay beyond. A narrow tunnel, too small to be a real passageway, too big to be a structural gap. And then, something moved. I sat up, pulse slamming against my ribs. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But then I saw it. A hand, thin, pale. It reached out toward the camera. Then, a face, peeking from the darkness. A woman. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at the lens. I could see every detail, the sharp bones of her face, the dark hollows under her eyes, her lips parted like she was about to speak. And then, she lurched forward. The footage cut to static. I dropped the camera, my entire body rigid with fear. I had seen her. She had seen me. And she was still in there, watching, waiting. And now, she knew I had found her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the camera like it might start playing on its own again, like maybe I had imagined what I had seen. I hadn't. There had been a woman inside the wall. She had reached for the camera. She had seen me. And now, she knew that I had seen her too. My body was tense, rigid, every muscle coiled like a spring, but my mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. Had she been there the whole time? Had she been living inside that hidden passage, moving between the walls? Had she been the one crying at night, knocking on my wall, listening to me when I thought I was alone? The thought made my stomach twist. I needed to get out of here. But then what? I couldn't just leave. If I walked away now, I'd never sleep again. I'd always wonder if she was still there, if she had moved into another wall, if she had already found someone else to watch. I needed to end this. I grabbed my phone and dialed the landlord. It went to voicemail, again. I left a message, my voice sharp and controlled. I know someone's been living in 2A. There's a hidden space in the wall, and I have it on camera. Either you deal with it, or I call the police. I ended the call before he could ignore it. Then, I grabbed the camera and forced myself to watch the footage again. The woman's face, pale and hollow, stared back at me. I paused the video, heart pounding, and looked closer. Her eyes were too wide, like she had been in the dark too long. Her skin looked gray, stretched, like she had been sick, or starving. She had been hiding. But from who? I didn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the old building made my skin prickle. I was hyper-aware of the wall next to me, of the empty apartment beyond it that wasn't really empty. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with a knife clutched in my hand, It was stupid, but it made me feel like I had some kind of control. At 3:45 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text. From the landlord. "I'll handle it. Don't go into 2A again." Something about those words made my skin crawl. I stared at the message, rereading it, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I should have been relieved. I should have felt safer. I didn't, because something about this wasn't right. The next day I stayed home waiting. The landlord showed up around noon. He didn't knock on my door. He went straight to 2A. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. There was movement, the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. Then muffled voices. Not just him. Someone else was in there. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent. Angry. Then a sound that made my stomach drop. A whimper. It was her. I didn't think I just moved. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I unlocked my door and stepped into the hallway. The door to 2A was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The landlord spun around, eyes wild. And in front of him, the woman. Filthy, thin, wrists bound with duct tape. Her mouth was covered, but her eyes, those same wide, terrified eyes from my camera, locked onto mine. She was real. Not a ghost. Not my imagination. A person, trapped inside this rotting apartment, inside the walls, for God knows how long. The landlord's face twisted into something ugly. "I told you to stay out of this." I didn't respond. I raised my phone, made sure he saw it recording. His expression shifted. A second of hesitation, a flicker of fear. Then he ran, shoved past me and bolted down the hallway. I didn't chase him. I turned to the woman and hurried toward her, ripping the tape from her mouth. Her voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "Please, don't let him take me again." I grabbed my phone with one hand, dialing 911 as I used the other to cut the bindings from her wrists. The dispatcher picked up. "My name is Redacted. I live at Redacted. There's a woman being held hostage in my building. The suspect just fled." The woman sagged against me, her breathing ragged, and I held her up, waiting for sirens, waiting for this nightmare to end. The police arrived fast. They searched the building top to bottom, but the landlord was gone. He had vanished, like he had known this moment was coming. The woman, her name was Hannah, was taken to the hospital. She had been missing for almost 2 years. The last thing she remembered before waking up in the walls was being in her car. Someone had pulled her over, flashing what looked like a badge. Then darkness. She had been kept somewhere else first, but eventually she was moved here, locked inside that hidden passage, in the space between walls. She had knocked. She had screamed, and no one had heard her. Until me. The investigation is still ongoing. The police found other hidden spaces in the building. No bodies, but other signs. Hair, scraps of fabric, old restraints. I moved out the next day. I didn't care about my security deposit. I didn't care about the lease. I just packed and left. Because even though she was gone, even though the apartment was empty again, I still felt like someone was watching, like there were still eyes inside those walls, and I wasn't waiting to find out if they were real. I don't even know where to start with this. I guess I just need to get it out because it's been messing with my head for days. Maybe someone here can help me make sense of it. For context, I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in a pretty old building, nothing fancy. It's the kind of place that hasn't been renovated in decades, but the rent is cheap, and I don't mind a little wear and tear. I've been here for a year now, and nothing weird has ever happened before this. No strange noises, no creepy neighbors, nothing. Just me, my apartment, and a pretty uneventful routine. That changed last week. I had the weekend off, so I figured I'd do a deep clean. You know, the kind where you move furniture, scrub everything down, all that. I don't do it as often as I should, so there was a lot of dust under things. I started in the bedroom. It's small, just my bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. I pushed the bed frame away from the wall to sweep underneath. The second I did, something caught my eye. A crumpled piece of paper. At first I thought it was just trash that had slipped under there somehow, but when I picked it up, I realized it wasn't just a random scrap of paper. It was a drawing. A child's drawing. The paper was wrinkled and faded, like it had been there for a long time. It showed 4 stick figures, drawn in crayon. Just simple shapes, circles for heads, straight lines for bodies. But what made my stomach tighten was that one of the figures had a thick red X drawn over it. And under each figure there were names. 3 of them were hard to make out because the crayon had smudged over time, but one of them clear as day was my name. I just sat there for a second, staring at it, my mind racing through explanations. I don't have kids. I don't know any kids. So how the hell did a drawing with my name end up under my bed? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was left by the last tenant. Maybe some kid had lived here before, and this was just some random thing they forgot. But that didn't sit right. Because this apartment was completely empty when I moved in. I would have seen this before. And the part that really messed with me? The dust under my bed was thick, like undisturbed for months thick. But the paper, it wasn't dusty at all. Almost like it hadn't been there long. I tried to forget about it. I threw the drawing in the trash and kept cleaning, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that night, I found myself digging through my lease agreement, trying to see if there was any info about the previous tenants. There wasn't, just standard paperwork. So I decided to ask the landlord. He's an older guy, late 60s maybe, and he doesn't talk much. Keeps to himself. I only ever see him when I drop off rent checks. I caught him the next morning when he was fixing a light in the hallway. "Hey, do you know who lived in my apartment before me?" He barely looked up. Couple of people over the years. "Any families? Kids?" That got his attention. He gave me this weird look. "Number not for a long time. Last guy was a single man. Before that, a woman, lived alone." "Why?" I hesitated. "I just found something weird when I was cleaning." He shrugged. "Could have been here a long time. That place is old. Probably nothing." I could tell he wasn't interested in talking about it, so I didn't push. But it felt off. Something about his reaction. Like maybe he knew more than he was letting on. That night I had trouble sleeping. Not because of the drawing, at least. That's what I told myself, but because my brain wouldn't shut up. I kept replaying it in my mind. The way my name was written. The red X. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke up to a sound. A soft rustling. Like paper moving. I turned over, still half asleep, and squinted into the dark. My room was quiet. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting a faint glow through the blinds. I listened. Nothing. I figured I was just hearing things and rolled over. Then a soft knock. Not on the door. On the floor. I froze. It was so faint, so soft, like someone tapping just beneath me. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but there was nothing, just silence. I must have stayed like that for 10 minutes, heart pounding, ears ringing from listening so hard. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the building settling. Old places make weird noises, right? But as I tried to go back to sleep, one thought kept creeping back into my mind. The drawing. Had it really been there all along? Or had someone put it there? The next morning I decided I needed to look around more. I started checking places I hadn't before. The back of drawers, inside cabinets, under furniture. And then in the kitchen, wedged behind the refrigerator, I found another drawing. My stomach dropped. It was the same 4 figures. Only this time, the red X was bigger. Like someone had gone over it again and again, pressing harder each time. And beneath the stick figures, there was something new. A word, written in shaky, uneven crayon. Soon. I felt sick. I needed to know who left these here. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the number for my landlord, and hit call. It rang once. Twice. Then he declined the call. I stared at my screen. He didn't even let it go to voicemail. Something was wrong. I could feel it now. This wasn't just some old drawings from a previous tenant. This was deliberate, and I was part of it. That's where I am now. I don't know what to do next. I don't want to overreact, but my gut is telling me this isn't random. Someone left those drawings here. Someone knew my name. And whoever they are, they're still here. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. I didn't go to work that day. I called in sick, though my boss barely acknowledged it before hanging up. Not surprising, I almost never call out. But I couldn't sit at my desk and pretend everything was normal, not after what I found. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the second drawing. The red X was darker, angrier than before. The word soon was scrawled underneath in the kind of unsteady handwriting a child would use. But no children had lived here. I knew that now. And yet someone had left this. I wanted to believe it had been here the whole time, hidden behind the fridge, but I couldn't make that lie fit anymore. It didn't make sense. That meant someone had put it there recently. While I was in the apartment, while I was sleeping, I spent the next hour checking every corner of my place, going through everything. Closets, cabinets, behind furniture, every possible hiding place. And then, in the hallway outside my bedroom, I found the floorboard. It was barely noticeable, but when I stepped on it, it shifted just slightly, enough for me to feel the difference. I knelt down, ran my fingers along the edge, and found a tiny gap. My heart was hammering in my chest. I pressed my fingers into the gap and lifted. The board came loose. Beneath it a space, a small, empty compartment. But it hadn't always been empty. I could see the marks on the wood, faint lines where something had been dragged in and out over time. Something roughly the size of the papers I had found. Someone had been hiding them here, and taking them out when they wanted me to find them. I dropped the floorboard back into place and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. Someone was in my apartment. Not just once, repeatedly. I couldn't pretend otherwise. This wasn't some weird prank or a forgotten relic from a past tenant. Someone had been here, leaving messages for me, watching my reaction. And my landlord knew something. That much was obvious now. He had brushed me off too quickly, shut down my questions before I could push further. And then he ignored my call. Why? Because he knew exactly what I would find. Or worse, he knew who left it. I didn't even bother texting him this time. I threw on my jacket and walked straight out of my apartment, heading for the first floor. His unit was tucked in the corner near the building's front entrance. I had only been down here a few times to drop off rent, to ask about a maintenance request. He had never invited me in. I knocked. Waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. Footsteps. Then the door opened just a crack. The landlord peered out, expression unreadable. Something wrong? I clenched my jaw. Yeah, actually, I need to talk to you. He didn't move. About what? I held up the second drawing. His eyes flicked to it. No reaction. Then, he sighed and opened the door fully. Come in. His apartment was smaller than mine, cluttered, dimly lit. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something stale, like old paper left in a damp room. He gestured to a chair near the kitchen table. Sit. I didn't. I held out the drawing. Tell me what this is. His expression didn't change. Looks like a kid's drawing. Yeah, and why is my name on it? That got a reaction. A flicker of something, guilt, annoyance, fear, passed through his eyes before he smoothed it over. I don't know. I didn't buy it. You said no kids have lived here. They haven't. Then who left this? Silence. He rubbed his hand over his face. Look, he muttered. This building is old. A lot of people have come and gone. Maybe one of them. I cut him off. I found a hidden compartment under my floor. His posture stiffened. Bingo. He tried to recover quickly, but it was too late. I pressed harder. I locked my door the second I got back inside, my hand gripping the deadbolt tighter than necessary. My mind was racing. The drawings weren't random. I wasn't the first person to find them. And the last tenant who did, They disappeared. That was all my landlord would give me before he shut down, before he all but told me to drop it and leave. I should have listened, but I couldn't, because if I was next, if something was actually happening in this apartment, I needed to know what I was up against. I needed to know the truth. I sat on my bed, staring at the floorboard. I had put it back in place earlier, but now it felt like it was mocking me, like there was something beneath it I hadn't found yet. I grabbed the edge and lifted it again. The empty space stared back at me, just a gap of nothingness. But my gut told me there was more. I ran my fingers along the wood, pressing against the bottom panel. It felt solid at first until I hit a loose section. My breath caught. I pressed harder. The wood shifted beneath my hand, and I managed to wedge my fingers underneath the thin panel and pull it free. And that's when I saw it. A small book. I hesitated before picking it up. It was thin, worn down, the edges of the pages curled from time and dust. I flipped it open. Inside, more drawings. Page after page of childlike sketches, all done in crayon. But these weren't just stick figures anymore. These were detailed, messy, chaotic. And the first image? A tiny person, curled up in a dark space. A closet. Or a crawl space. Or a hiding spot. I turned the page. Another drawing. A tall figure standing outside the hiding place. A hand reaching inside. The next page, the small figure being dragged out, and below it a word. Number. I felt sick. These weren't just random sketches. These were memories. Someone had been hiding, and someone had found them. I kept flipping, my hands shaking now. Each image was worse than the last. A child crying in the corner of a room. A locked door. A figure standing in the doorway watching. Then, a drawing of 3 stick figures. 2 were big. 1 was small. The small one had a red X over it, just like the drawing I found under my bed. I swallowed, my mouth dry. I didn't want to turn the page. I did anyway. The last drawing was different. It wasn't crayon. It was written in shaky black ink. Just 5 words. I don't want to go. I slammed the book shut. I needed answers. Now, the landlord wasn't going to help me. But maybe someone else could. I grabbed my laptop and started digging. I searched for missing person reports connected to this building, to this area, anything. At first I found nothing. But then, an article from 10 years ago. A missing child case. A little girl named Lena Parker, 8 years old. Last seen in this building. My breath hitched. I clicked on the article, scrolling through the details. She had lived here with her mother. One day, the mother left for work. When she came back, Lena was gone. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses. Just vanished. I scrolled down, my pulse pounding. The article mentioned the last person to see her. My landlord. My vision blurred for a second. I read the words over and over again, as if they would change. He had been the maintenance man at the time. He was the last person who saw Lena alive. He told police he had fixed a leaky pipe in their unit that morning, that he left and never saw her again. He was never charged. They never found her. She was never seen again. I sat back, my breathing shallow. The drawings, the floorboard, the missing girl, it all clicked into place. She had been hiding here, maybe from him, maybe from someone else. She had been trapped inside these walls, in this apartment, in a space no one knew existed. And now, years later, someone was reminding me. I heard it before I even closed my laptop. A faint scraping noise. It was coming from under the floor. My whole body went cold. I slowly stood up, staring at the spot where I had found the book. The scraping was soft, subtle, like something was being pushed against the wood. A piece of paper. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I knelt down, lifted the floorboard one last time, and there it was. A new drawing. Fresh. The red crayon was still smudged, like it had been made just moments ago. I picked it up, my hand shaking. It was me, a stick figure standing in my bedroom. But this time, the red X was over my head, and beneath it, a message. He's coming. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, staring at the new drawing in my hands. The red X was over my head this time, and beneath it, a message. He's coming. My chest felt tight. I wasn't stupid. I had been playing detective, digging into something I had no business knowing. And now whoever left these drawings, the same person who had been slipping them under the floor, hiding them in my apartment, watching me, was telling me I had gone too far. That it was too late. I needed to leave. Now. But I didn't. Not yet. Because there was one more thing I had to do. I had to confront the landlord. He had lied. Not just a little, not just omitting the truth. He had outright deceived me. He had told me no kids had ever lived here. That was a lie. I had the proof right in front of me. A missing child. A hidden space inside the apartment. And the landlord, the last person to see her. I couldn't ignore the feeling clawing at my gut any longer. He knew something. Maybe he had been the one to leave the drawings. Maybe he was trying to scare me off before I uncovered the full truth. Or maybe he was the reason Lena Parker was never found. I didn't give myself time to overthink. I grabbed my phone, started recording audio, and headed straight for his unit. The hallway felt longer than usual. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I knocked on his door. Silence. I knocked again, louder. A slow shuffle from inside. Then the door creaked open, just enough for me to see one bloodshot eye staring back at me. "What do you want?" No pretense this time. No fake politeness. I held up the drawing. "You tell me." His eyes flicked to the paper in my hand, but he didn't react. Not the way I expected. He didn't look surprised. Just tired. Like he had been waiting for this. "Where did you find that?" His voice was hoarse. "Under the floorboards." My grip on the paper tightened. "Along with a book, and I found something else too. A news article about Lena Parker." His jaw tensed. "You said no kids lived here. That was a lie." He exhaled through his nose. "Go home." "Number." I stepped forward. "Tell me what happened. Tell me why someone keeps leaving these." His grip on the doorframe tightened. "If you were smart, you'd stop looking." That's not an answer. I expected him to get angry, to slam the door in my face, but he didn't. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed, low and bitter. "You think you're the first?" he asked. I froze. His gaze drifted down the hall, almost like he was remembering something. "Every few years," he murmured, "someone like you moves in. Someone who starts digging." A sick feeling curled in my stomach. "And then?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes snapped back to mine. Then they disappear. I stepped back, my pulse slamming against my ribs. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. I tried again. "What happened to Lena?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't want to know." I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket. The recording was still running. But I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what came next. Still, I had come too far to stop now. "Did you take her?" I asked. He flinched like I had hit him. "God, no." He ran a hand down his face. "I tried to help her." Silence stretched between us. And then, finally spoke. "She was hiding," he said, his voice quieter now. "I found her one night, maybe a week before she disappeared. She was curled up in the laundry room, shivering. I asked where her mother was, but she just kept saying, 'He's coming,' and..." A shiver ran through me. "Who?" I asked. He shook his head. "She never said. Just kept drawing pictures in the dust on the floor, over and over." He swallowed hard. "The same thing every time. 4 figures, one crossed out." My throat tightened. "Just like the drawing I found." She was terrified. His voice was distant now, like he was somewhere else. I told her to go home, but she refused. Said she wasn't safe there, that he would find her. He rubbed his temples, and then, one day, she was gone. Just like that. My voice came out hoarse. He nodded. Her mother came home from work, and Lena wasn't there. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. I swallowed hard. And you didn't tell the police about what she said, about the drawings? I did. His eyes darkened. They didn't care. They said kids make things up, that maybe she ran away. I thought of the drawings hidden in my apartment, the notebook under the floorboards, the warning I had just received. He's coming. I backed away. You need to leave, the landlord said again. His voice wasn't threatening. It was pleading. You don't understand, he continued. Whoever did this, whoever took her, they never left. My stomach turned to ice. The words didn't make sense, but I felt the truth in them. I opened my mouth to ask more, but at that moment, a loud knock sounded from my apartment door. My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I could see the dark outline of someone standing outside my door. The landlord's face drained of color. Don't answer it. His voice was barely audible. The knocking came again, harder this time. My body refused to move. Then, a single sheet of paper slid under my door. A new drawing. I already knew what it would be. A single stick figure, standing alone, a red X over its head. And this time, there were no other figures left. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. The knock had stopped, but the paper was still there, half tucked under my door. The landlord was staring at it too, his face drained of color. His breathing had gone shallow, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. Don't, he whispered, just don't. But I had to, because I already knew what I would see. I stepped forward, my fingers stiff as I reached down and picked it up. A new drawing. Just one stick figure now, standing alone. No other figures beside it. A red X over its head. My head, and beneath it one word. Tonight. My stomach turned over. My pulse felt like static in my ears. Pack a bag, the landlord said suddenly. Get your keys, get your phone, you're leaving. My voice came out hoarse. What? He grabbed my arm, harder than I expected, and turned me to face him. You don't have time. His voice was a low, urgent whisper. Whoever's doing this, they're coming for you. I yanked my arm away, backing up. My head was spinning. None of this made sense. I don't even know who they are, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flicked to my door. His jaw was clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out. I don't either, he admitted. I just know they don't stop. Not until you're gone. Something about the fear in his voice rattled me. This was real, and if I didn't leave now, I might not get the chance. I turned and walked straight back to my apartment. The hallway felt wrong, too quiet, like someone was listening, watching. I locked the door behind me and forced myself to think. I needed to go, now. But as I grabbed my bag and stuffed it with the bare essentials, wallet, phone, charger, shoes, jacket, my mind wouldn't stop replaying everything. The drawings, the hidden floorboard, the missing girl, the landlord's warnings, and the last person who lived here, the one who disappeared. Had they gotten the same drawing, the same warnings? Had they tried to leave too? I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get the hell out. I grabbed my bag and turned for the door, but I stopped. The air in the apartment had changed. I felt it before I heard it. A presence, a shift in the silence, and then the softest sound, a floorboard creaking. Inside the apartment, behind me, my breath hitched. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see. The closet door was open. Not much, just an inch, a thin black gap in the darkness. Someone was inside. I didn't wait. I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and ran. Down the hall, past the landlord's unit. out the front door of the building, into the night, my lungs burning, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop running until I was across the street, halfway down the block. Only then did I turn back. From where I stood, I could see my apartment window, dimly lit from the street lamp outside. And I swear to God, for a split second I saw a face in the glass. Not my reflection. Someone else. Watching me. Still. Unblinking. I left that night. Never went back. Never even tried to get my things. I broke my lease, ignored the landlord's calls, and crashed on a friend's couch for a while before finding another place. Somewhere far away. I tried to move on. Tried to tell myself it was just some sick game, some deranged prank by someone who had access to my apartment. But that doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the drawings that got worse every time. It doesn't explain the person hiding in my walls. And it doesn't explain why it keeps happening. A month after I left, I checked the rental listings. My apartment was back up. Same price, same description, no mention of anything that happened. I scrolled down, looking at the photos, and then I saw something that made my skin crawl. A picture of the bedroom. It was empty now, my bed, my furniture, all of it gone. But on the wall, near the closet, I could see it. A single red crayon mark. A thick X. Like someone had started another drawing, waiting for the next tenant. I don't really know how to start this. I've told a few close friends, but every time I do, I feel like I sound crazy. But I swear this happened. For a while, I worked as a park ranger at a remote national park. I won't say which one because, well, if you've ever heard of the missing 411 cases, you'll understand why. Most of the job was boring, checking trails, making sure campers weren't doing anything stupid, responding to the occasional lost hiker. Pretty standard stuff. But the nights were different. The park had designated campgrounds, but there were always those hardcore hikers who wanted to venture deep into the backcountry. Those were the ones we worried about. Because sometimes they didn't come back. And sometimes they called for help. This happened in late September, right before the park started shutting down for the season. I was covering the overnight shift, monitoring the radio while my partner Dave was out on patrol. It was a quiet night, until the walkie crackled. Not the main radio, but my walkie-talkie. Now, that might not seem weird, but the only people who had access to our channel were park staff. And this voice? It wasn't anyone I knew. I grabbed the walkie, holding it to my ear. The transmission was full of static, but beneath it I could hear it. A man's voice. Low, panicked. Help me. I sat up fast, my stomach twisting. Hello? This is Park Ranger Lewis. Can you repeat that? The signal was weak, garbled, like the voice was coming from far away. Then, clearer this time. Help me, please. I'm lost. I don't know where I am. I grabbed the radio, flipping to the main frequency. HQ, this is Lewis. I just got an SOS on my walkie. Do we have any hikers reported missing? There was a pause, then static. Finally, the supervisor's voice came through. Negative. No missing persons reports. I hesitated. If no one had been reported missing, who the hell was on our private channel? I switched back to the walkie. Sir, can you tell me your name, your location? Nothing. Just static. Then, deep breathing. Slow, labored. Like whoever was on the other end was hurt. It's dark. I don't know where I am. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight, already heading for the ATV parked outside the ranger station. Okay, stay calm. Do you have any landmarks nearby? Anything you can see? For a long moment, silence. Then, why do I say you? I stopped cold. The walkie hissed with static, the signal warping, stretching, distorting. My heart hammered. I turned in a slow circle, flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. Just the empty ranger station, the dark woods, the distant mountains. I swallowed hard, gripping the walkie tight. What do you mean, you see me? The static spiked. Then, laughter. Low. Breathless. Not a man's voice anymore. I dropped the walkie. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, the speaker still crackling, hissing like a thing alive. I backed up toward the ATV, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Then, just before I reached it, the walkie went silent. Not static, not breathing, just dead air, like whatever had been speaking had left. Or worse, it was never there to begin with. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I barely breathed. I sat in the ranger station with the doors locked, the radio clutched in my hand, waiting for the voice to come back. It never did. The next morning I told my supervisor. He just gave me a look. The kind that said, "Drop it." I did. For the rest of my time as a ranger, I never worked the night shift alone again. But the worst part? A week later, a hiker was reported missing. When they found his body, it was deep in the woods, miles from any trail. His radio was still clutched in his frozen hands. The Rangers never released the recording, but I know what they heard, because that night, when I was all alone in the dark, I heard it too. A week after the night I heard the voice on my walkie, the missing hiker's body was found. It was a search and rescue team that discovered him, about 12 miles from the nearest trail, way off any marked paths. He was face down in a dry creek bed, body twisted like he had fallen from somewhere high. His radio was still gripped in his stiff fingers, pressed tight against his mouth like he'd died calling for help. But here's the thing. His radio? It was on our private ranger frequency. The same one that no civilian should have access to. The same one I had heard that voice on the week before. The coroner ruled it exposure and a fall injury. Said he must have gotten lost, wandered too far, slipped and broken his leg before succumbing to the cold. A tragic accident. Case closed. Except it didn't make sense. The way his body was found. There were no tracks leading to or from him. Not his, not animals, not anyone's. Like he had just appeared there. I asked to hear the final transmission on his radio, but the higher-ups wouldn't release it. Classified evidence, they said, even to park staff. But one of the search team guys, someone I trusted, pulled me aside a few days later. His face was pale, hands shaking when he lit his cigarette. He looked me dead in the eye and said that radio was broadcasting. I swallowed. Broadcasting what? He hesitated, looking over his shoulder, then leaned in. Dead air. I frowned. What do you mean? He exhaled shakily. I mean, it was transmitting the whole time. When we found him, when we checked his radio. But there was nothing on the other end, no voice, no static, just this hollow, empty sound, like something was still listening. A chill ran down my spine. And Lewis, he continued, his voice dropped even lower. The battery was dead. I quit the job a month later. I don't go hiking anymore. And I don't ever keep a walkie-talkie in my house. Because sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The low hum crackling static. And just beneath it, breathing. A few years back, I was in a tight spot financially. Bills were piling up, and my part-time gig at the local diner wasn't cutting it. One evening, while scrolling through job listings, I stumbled upon an ad. Earn $1,000 a week for part-time cleaning. Flexible hours. It sounded like a godsend. I was skeptical, but desperate. The contact was a local number, so I decided to call. A man named Mr. Thompson answered. He explained that they needed someone to clean out apartments after tenants had abruptly left. He assured me the job was straightforward. Clean the place, dispose of any left-behind items, and ensure it was ready for the next occupant. The pay was indeed $1,000 per week for about 20 hours of work. It seemed too good to be true, but I convinced myself that maybe I'd just gotten lucky. My first assignment was an apartment in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. The building was old, but well-maintained. Mr. Thompson met me outside, handed me the keys, and told me to call him once I was done. He didn't come in with me, which I found odd, but I brushed it off. Inside, the apartment was eerily pristine. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a moment. Dishes were in the sink, A half-empty coffee cup on the table, and even a newspaper dated 2 days prior lay on the couch. It was as if the tenant had vanished into thin air. As I started cleaning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times I thought I heard faint whispers, but whenever I paused to listen, there was only silence. In the bedroom, I found a journal on the nightstand. Curiosity got the better of me, and I skimmed through it. The entries were mundane at first, notes about work, grocery lists, reminders. But the last entry caught my attention. March 15th. I keep seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but now I'm certain something is here with me. I hear whispers at night, calling my name. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. A chill ran down my spine. I closed the journal and decided to finish up quickly. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small door in the hallway that I hadn't opened. It was a closet, mostly empty except for a few old coats. But behind the coats, I found a trap door leading to a crawl spaces. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The space was dark, but I could make out something glinting in the far corner. Using my phone's flashlight, I crawled in and reached for the object. It was a small, ornate box. Inside the box were several Polaroid photos. Each photo was of a different person, standing in the very apartment I was in. They all looked distressed, and in each photo there was a shadowy figure standing just behind them, barely visible. I felt a cold draft and heard a whisper right next to my ear. I bolted out of the crawl space, grabbed my things, and left the apartment, locking the door behind me. I called Mr. Thompson and told him I couldn't continue with the job. He didn't seem surprised. "I understand," he said. "You're not the first to leave abruptly." I never went back, and I never collected the payment. To this day, I wonder about the people in those photos and what might have happened to them. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear whispers calling my name. There were 5 of us. 5 friends who had once been inseparable, but over the years had drifted apart, each of us pulled in different directions by work, relationships, or just life in general. The plan seemed simple enough. A weekend camping trip in an isolated forest, far from everything, no phones, no distractions, just the fire, the stars, and the hope of reconnecting. It was Ethan who brought it up first. Ethan, the one who used to be the glue that held us all together. He'd been the one to organize our little gatherings in the past, even when it seemed like no one else could be bothered. This time, though, it was different. His message in the group chat was casual, almost nostalgic. "How about we do something crazy? Go camping. We all need a break." At first it seemed like a bad idea, but then we all agreed. The thought of getting away from the noise of daily life was appealing, even if the idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere made me uneasy. There was Jamie, always the practical one, the one who kept track of everyone's schedules and made sure things got done. She had been Ethan's best friend since childhood, and even though they'd grown apart over the years, I could tell that he still held a special place in her life. When she agreed to the trip, I figured it was because she needed a break just as much as the rest of us. Her job had been stressing her out, and her recent breakup hadn't helped. She seemed eager to get away from everything. Then there was Tom. He was the jokester, the one who could lighten any mood. Tom always had something sarcastic to say, always made everyone laugh. I used to love how he could always crack a joke even in the most awkward situations. But lately, I noticed that even his jokes seemed hollow, like he was trying too hard to keep the group's energy up. He had just started a new job, and I could tell he was struggling. He didn't say much about it, but the trip seemed like his way of trying to reset. Sarah was the quiet one. She never said much, but she always noticed everything. She was the observer of the group, the one who seemed to see things we didn't. I'd always admired her sensitivity, but I could never tell if it was a gift or a curse. She hadn't been in touch much over the past few months, but I was glad to hear that she was coming along. I guess we all had our reasons for wanting to leave the world behind, even if none of us spoke them aloud. And then there was Ryan. Ryan was the one who never really fit in, the one who always seemed off. He wasn't the type to open up, even though we had known him for years. There was always something about him, something cold and detached. He'd been part of our group since high school, but even then, I could never put my finger on what it was about him that made me uneasy. He was quiet. So quiet that sometimes I forgot he was even there. And yet, every now and then, when he did speak, it felt like he was saying something just a little too strange, too calculated. When he said he was coming along, I was surprised, but I didn't think much of it. After all, it had been years since we all hung out together. Maybe this was his way of reconnecting. I should have paid more attention to that feeling, the one I'd always had, the nagging feeling that something was off about Ryan. But at the time, it didn't seem important. And so, we went. The forest was more isolated than I had imagined. Ethan drove us out there in his old rusted truck, winding down narrow gravel roads that seemed to vanish into the trees. The further we went, the more I began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. I could see it in Sarah's face, too. She stared out the window, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. Jamie, of course, was in charge of everything. She pulled out maps, made sure we had enough supplies, and started organizing the campsite with military precision. She always had a way of taking control, and I couldn't help but feel a little relieved that she was here. It was easy to let her do the heavy lifting while I watched. Tom, on the other hand, was goofing around, trying to get everyone to play a ridiculous game of charades while we set up the tents. His voice echoed through the trees, breaking the silence in a way that made me shiver slightly. It was as if the forest didn't like being disturbed. Ryan was just, there. He hadn't said much since we arrived. He barely even glanced at the campsite. He was standing a few yards away, leaning against a tree, looking off into the distance. He had a strange intensity about him, something that made me wonder if he was really present or if his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. Ryan had always been like this, quiet, distant. Maybe that was just who he was. But I couldn't ignore the prickling on the back of my neck. Something was wrong. By the time night fell, the forest felt even more suffocating. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax. There's nothing out here but trees." But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered. more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different, distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax. There's nothing out here but trees." But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, Just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different, distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. Tom slammed on the gas and we sped off into the forest, the tires screeching as we tore down the narrow path. We didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting away. We made it. Somehow, we made it. We found service far enough down the road, and I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the campsite was empty. Ryan was gone. No trace of him. No evidence of what had happened. Nothing but the ashes of the fire we'd left behind. The police questioned us, but we didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain what we'd seen? How do you tell them about the man who was never really a man? The monster who had been walking among us for years. When they left, we drove back to the city in silence. I could feel the weight of the journal in my bag, but I didn't want to open it again. Not now, not ever. We were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was still out there, waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Because in the end, I realized something. He had always been in control. He had always been one step ahead of us. And now, I couldn't help but wonder, had we really escaped? Or had he just let us go? I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Sure, I'd heard the rumors. The whispers about the Northwood dorms being haunted, about the missing student from 10 years ago, about the strange knocking sounds people claimed to hear late at night, but I figured every college had its share of urban legends. I had only been on campus for a month, settling into the routine of early classes, late-night study sessions, and cheap cafeteria food. My roommate Daniel was the opposite of me, loud, outgoing, constantly surrounded by people. We got along well enough, though I often found myself retreating to the dorm when he went out partying. Northwood had an older, almost forgotten feel to it. The hallways were too quiet at night, the lights dimmer than they should have been, casting long, flickering shadows on the peeling walls. My dorm was on the 4th floor, one of the older wings that had barely been renovated. The room was small, the window overlooked the woods behind campus, and the radiator made strange ticking noises when the air got cold. It started with the door handle. One night, around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. The slow, deliberate turn of the knob. Not a rattle, not an accidental bump. Someone was trying to open the door. I sat up, my heart knocking against my ribs. "Daniel?" I called, but I knew he wasn't back yet. He had texted me an hour ago saying he was crashing at a friend's place. The knob stilled, but I could hear breathing on the other side. Soft, measured, waiting. I reached for my phone, but as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the sound stopped. I waited, frozen, listening. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself it was just someone drunk trying to find their room. It was a college dorm, after all. Stupid things happened. But then I noticed something. The peephole was covered. A shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't noticed before, but now that I looked, the tiny circle was completely blacked out, like something, or someone, was standing directly in front of it, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel came back, oblivious, hungover, laughing about something stupid his friends had done. I wanted to tell him, but somehow, saying it out loud made it too real. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time I was awake, sitting at my desk, headphones in, drowning in an essay that was due the next morning. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and stale dorm room air when I heard it. Knob turning. I ripped my headphones off, my breath caught in my throat. I turned, staring at the door. It turned again, slow, testing. And then, from beneath the door, a shadow. Not just a shadow cast by the dim hallway lights. This one moved. It stretched, creeping inward as if something was pushing itself underneath the door, seeping like smoke into the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then a knock. 3 soft, deliberate taps. Not from the outside. From inside my closet. I sat there, frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I told myself it was my imagination, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that I had misheard where the sound had come from, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The knock had been inside the closet. Slow, intentional. My skin prickled with cold sweat as I forced myself to turn my head toward the door. The shadow beneath it was gone. The doorknob was still. The hallway outside was silent. But my closet door, slightly ajar, just enough for darkness to seep out, felt like it was breathing. I stared at it, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but some part of me, the logical part, refused to move. This was a dorm. A normal dorm, in a normal college. There was no way someone had been inside my room. No way I hadn't noticed. And yet, the air felt thick with something unseen. Something watching. I stood up, slow and deliberate, my chair making the faintest scrape against the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Movement, breathing, the shift of weight in the dark. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the vending machine down the hall. My fingers clenched into fists. I wasn't going to let paranoia win. This was my room, my space. I wasn't about to start jumping at shadows. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, until I was standing right in front of the closet. My own reflection stared back at me from the cheap mirror attached to the door, wide-eyed, pale. I lifted a hand, hesitated, then grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the same cramped space filled with my jackets, a stack of shoeboxes, and the laundry I'd been too lazy to put away. My breath left me in a shaky exhale. Of course, there was nothing. There was never anything. I was exhausted, overworked, and psyching myself out over some stupid prank. I shut the closet, locked my dorm room for good measure, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my limbs heavy with exhaustion. I went through my routine, barely thinking, my mind fogged over with the kind of fatigue that clings to you like a weight. I grabbed my bag and went to class, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The campus was buzzing with its usual energy, people rushing to lectures, half-asleep students clutching coffee cups like lifelines, the distant sound of someone blasting music from their dorm window. It felt normal. But then I saw the bulletin board near the student center, a cluster of flyers pinned to the cork. My stomach twisted as my eyes landed on one in particular. Missing person. The photo was of a student, a guy around my age. Short brown hair, glasses, a familiar grin frozen in time. My brain struggled to place where I had seen him before, and then it clicked. His dorm was down the hall from mine. I didn't know him well, had only seen him in passing, but a cold chill ran through me as I read the details. Missing for 5 days. Last seen leaving the dorm late at night. No sign of forced entry in his room. No leads. A creeping unease settled into my stomach. 5 days ago, that was around the time I had started hearing the sounds at my door. When I had first noticed the peephole was covered, I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Colleges had thousands of students. People disappeared all the time. Ran away, dropped out, left without telling anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that it was connected. That night I double-locked my door. I shoved my desk chair under the handle, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. It made me feel stupid, but I didn't care. Sleep came in restless waves, every creak of the old building sending a spike of anxiety through me. At some point, deep into the night, I woke up to breathing. Not mine, not Daniel's, right outside my door. Slow, shallow, like someone standing just inches away, listening. I stayed completely still, my heart racing so violently I thought it might shake the bed frame. My phone was under my pillow and I barely dared to move as I reached for it, my fingers shaking as I turned on the screen. 3:12 a.m. A single notification glowed at the top. Motion detected at your door. I stared at it, my mouth dry. The security app linked to the dorm's hallway cameras had picked something up. My hands fumbled as I tapped it open, my breath caught in my throat. The screen flickered, the grainy camera footage loading. My dorm door was in frame, the dim hallway stretching out in both directions. For a moment, it showed nothing. Then, movement. Someone was standing right in front of my door. Not knocking, not trying the handle, just standing there. And then, they bent down. I watched paralyzed as the figures slowly lowered themselves until they were eye level with the keyhole. Watching. My stomach turned to ice. They knew I was awake, and they were waiting for me to move. A cold sensation spread through my chest, like my body knew something was deeply wrong before my mind could fully process it. I gripped my phone tighter, barely breathing as I watched the screen. The figure outside my door remained crouched, completely still, just inches away from the peephole. I couldn't make out their face, only a vague silhouette in the dim hallway light. They weren't knocking, they weren't moving, just waiting. A part of me wanted to call out, to ask who it was, to break the silence. But another, much stronger instinct screamed at me to stay quiet. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They wanted to watch. The realization sent a deep electric dread through my limbs. I stayed frozen, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial on my phone. If I called someone, would they hear? Would they try to get in? And then they reached up. Slowly, deliberately, their hand lifted toward the peephole. I watched through the grainy footage, my pulse hammering against my ribs, as their fingers pressed against the tiny glass circle. Covering it, the screen went black. I sucked in a sharp breath. They knew. They knew I was watching. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hallway camera remained dark, my dorm eerily silent except for the soft hum of the old radiator. I didn't move. My skin felt too tight, my body stiff with anticipation, waiting for the next sound, the next shift in the air. But it never came. After what felt like hours, I tapped the app again, refreshing the feed. When the camera flickered back to life, the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. The peephole was clear. But something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside wasn't gone, that they were still nearby, listening. The air in my dorm suddenly felt heavier, the walls closing in, the silence too sharp. I had to check. I had to know. Heart pounding, I slipped out of bed and moved toward the door as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. My hands were damp with sweat as I reached for the knob, pressing my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything beyond it. I inhaled deeply, bracing myself. Then, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Just the dull hum of the exit sign at the far end, the distant murmur of someone's TV behind a closed door. Nothing unusual. Except for one thing. A small, folded piece of paper lay on the ground right outside my room. I stared at it, my skin crawling with unease. It hadn't been there before. Slowly, I crouched and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. There was only one sentence scrawled across the page in uneven handwriting. I like watching you sleep. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My fingers gripped the paper so tightly it crumpled in my palm. Someone had been inside the dorm building, standing at my door, watching me. Maybe for days. I slammed the door shut, locked it, then shoved my desk chair under the handle again. My breaths were coming too fast, my mind racing through every possibility. Every time I had dismissed the strange noises, the shifts in the air, the creeping sense of being watched. This wasn't in my head, it wasn't some prank. Someone was fixated on me, and they were getting closer. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind against the window made my skin prickle with paranoia. I kept the dorm lights on, my back pressed against the wall, watching the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. No more knocks, no more notes. Just an unbearable silence stretching through the early hours of the morning. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to move. My limbs ached from tension, my thoughts clouded with exhaustion, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to do something. By the time I made it to campus security, my hands were still shaking. I showed them the note, explained the knocking, the covered peephole, the motion alert from my phone. The officer behind the desk listened with a concerned expression, nodding as I spoke. But when I finished, his response made my stomach twist. "We'll look into it," he said. "But there's not much we can do unless an actual crime was committed." I felt my breath catch. "What do you mean?" "Someone was outside my room in the middle of the night. They left this." I held up the crumpled paper, but he only sighed. Look, dorms have hundreds of students. Pranks happen all the time. And unless we have footage of someone breaking in, it's not really a police matter." I stared at him, my pulse drumming in my ears. "So that's it? You're just going to ignore this?" "We'll increase patrols in your building," he offered. "If anything else happens, let us know." I wanted to scream. Instead, I grabbed the note and walked out. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about things normally, but everything felt off. I couldn't focus in class. I kept scanning the lecture hall, searching for any familiar face from the footage. Was it someone I knew? Had they been watching me all along? When I returned to my dorm that evening, my hands were slick with sweat as I unlocked the door. I braced myself for something, another note, a new sign that they'd been back. But the room was exactly as I had left it. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. I sat on the bed, my mind churning. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it was worse, stronger. And then, my phone buzzed. A new motion alert. I swallowed hard, my fingers hesitating before tapping the notification. The camera feed loaded, flickering slightly, and when it cleared, I stopped breathing. The hallway was empty, but the door to my dorm was slightly open. My entire body locked up, I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. A single realization took hold, icy and paralyzing. They weren't outside anymore. They were already inside. I didn't move, didn't blink. My breath barely passed my lips as my gaze flicked toward the closet door. Just like before, it was slightly ajar. The air in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on me from all angles. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my hands barely able to keep steady. 901, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but before a sound could leave my throat, the closet door creaked open. The line went dead. The next thing I remember is running, sprinting down the hall, pushing past anyone in my way, my only thought getting out. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold glow of the streetlights. The police arrived within minutes. They searched my dorm, questioned my neighbors, even checked security footage. But in the end, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no figure on the cameras, no fingerprints but my own. They suggested I might have imagined it, that I had left my door unlocked and the wind had pushed it open, but I knew better. I didn't go back. That same night, I packed my things and stayed with a friend off campus. The next morning, I put in a request for a room transfer. A week later, I moved to another dorm in a different building. For a while, nothing happened. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe now. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up with the same suffocating feeling. The sensation that someone was there, just beyond my line of sight, standing in the shadows, waiting. And a few weeks later, when I was scrolling through my phone, trying to clear out my old notifications, I saw it. An unread message. No name, no number. Just a single text sent the night I fled my dorm. You were right to run.